We all live in the shadow of Midnight's Children, the book that said that an Indian novel doesn't have to sound like a novel written by an Englishman who lived 100 years ago. It can have its own language and its own sense of vibrance.
How do you see the Civil War and, how did it affect you? It's fiction after all, but we all have our influences. What is your take on the tragedy which has happened with Sri Lanka, and how important was it to present it, but not as non-fiction?
So the Civil War, you've got to understand that we grew up with this notion of a war that will never end. It happened when I was a child, and we had many false dawns.
Now Sri Lanka is again in the middle of some turmoil economically. So how do you perceive it, and how will Sri Lanka bounce back from there?
Well, like I say, I lived too long in Sri Lanka to believe in these false dawns.
Congratulations on the Booker victory. And your first book was received very well in India as well. But this is global kind of recognition, and you got a wider audience after your second novel. So how are the two books different? And because you self-published the first one.
No, I mean, they were both difficult to write, and I seem to be writing every one of my books twice. And same thing with Chinaman. But also, when you're writing your debut novel, you're grateful if it gets published. You don't expect that it'll get published overseas and so on. So that was all my goal was for that. But you don't think about writing a second novel when you're writing your first one. And yeah, you're right. My ambition was to get it into India. I thought, okay, for a Sri Lankan writer, that's our ambition. Get it to the subcontinent. You don't think beyond that. So, I mean, it achieved that, and then it was published in the UK and the US, and it won some prizes. So, that was a great start. But then suddenly I had to think about the second book. That took a good 7 years, if not longer. Also, during that time, life happened, I suppose. I'd finished my first book, and yeah, I couldn't find a publisher. I didn't know how to approach it, so I self-published it. And then I took a job in Singapore, got married, and then while I was over there, slowly Chinaman got momentum. But yeah, in the interim, I had 2 kids, moved country again. So life happened as well. And then when I finally sat down to write, I want to write something completely different from the first book. And that's why I chose to write a ghost story about Sri Lanka's past. But all the books are a struggle. Everything I write is a struggle, even an article. And now I come to accept it that everything's going to be hard. And it's not necessarily going to be easier. Just because you've won a prize as prestigious as the Booker doesn't mean the next book's going to write itself. Or if anything, the next book's going to be harder to write. And if the next book's no good, it's going to get hammered. And so these pressures are there. But it's been 15 years, and I've written 2 books and a short story collection. So I'm quite a slow writer. I'd like to speed things up. But these things take as long as they need to take, I guess.
It took a lot of years between the first Booker from Sri Lanka to the second one. And how young were you when The English Patient won the Booker? And did it influence you in any way?
No, certainly. So early 90s. So I would have been, my late teens at that time. And when I was growing up, I was a reader, and I'm still a reader. I can't wait to go to the Jaipur bookshop now. And there wasn't a Sri Lankan section in our local bookshops. There were Sri Lankan books which you'd find on lower shelves, many of them self-published, perhaps poorly edited, and compared to the international books which were on display. And so it never occurred to me that I thought, why can't a Sri Lankan write a book that can sit up there next to the bestsellers from internationally? But something like, Michael Ondaatje winning for the English, and English Patient's not really about Sri Lanka, though Michael Ondaatje wrote Running in the Family and later Anil's Ghost, and so we identified him as a Sri Lankan writer. But then Romesh Gunasekara, another very elegant writer, quite a class act, he was another inspiration, got nominated for Reef and Monkfish Moon, two of his favorite books of his. And Shyam Selvadurai, Funny Boy, that was quite groundbreaking for the 90s. And a man I've spoken of a lot, Carl Muller. Carl Muller, not as widely celebrated as those 3 that I mentioned, but for Sri Lankans, I think one of the first local writers who wrote how Sri Lankans spoke. So that was inspiring to me. And then also, as South Asian writers, we all live in the shadow of Midnight's Children, the book that said that an Indian novel doesn't have to sound like a novel written by an Englishman who lived 100 years ago. It can have its own language and its own sense of vibrancy and pizzazz. And I think then Arundhati Roy winning for God of Small Things. So suddenly, South Asian literature, it was viable to attempt to write not just about South Asia, about our own countries, but in our own voices. And I mean, since then, Pakistan literature has been through a golden age, and so has Indian literature, and literature from Bangladesh, Nepal as well has been. So this has all been inspiring. But yeah, you're right, it's been a long journey. But the greatest gift that Michael Ondaatje did was when he won the Booker Prize, he set up the Gratian Foundation, the Gratian Trust, which awards for the best piece of Sri Lankan writing in English. It awards a prize every year. And that Chinaman, my first book, was submitted to that. I've submitted many times, and I know it's inspired a whole generation of Sri Lankan writers in English to start writing. So now you'll have a Sri Lankan section in a bookshop. And now, yes, you'll have a Sri Lankan book that's up there with the best of the stuff from the rest of the world. And so I think, yeah, we've come a long way from the early 90s and the first Booker.
So you've done your part in putting Sri Lanka on the map up there with your latest victory as well. The subtext of your book, this new one, is the Sri Lankan Civil War, and of course the investigative part of it as well. So, how do you see the Civil War, and how did it affect you? It's fiction after all, but we all have our influences. What is your take on the tragedy which has happened with Sri Lanka, and how important was it to present it, but not as non-fiction?
So the Civil War, you've got to understand that we grew up with this notion of a war that will never end. It happened when I was a child, and we had many false dawns. There was the peace accord of '89, which we thought, okay, peace after a decade of war. Nothing of the sort. War broke out again on multiple fronts. '94, there was a new government coming in. Again, there was a lot of hope. The war escalated. We won the Cricket World Cup, and we thought, okay, we can unite behind one cause, and a great Tamil player, Muralidharan, he can be a symbol that brings us together. The war kept going. We had the ceasefire, and these are just a few key areas. And then we had the 2005 election, which we thought, again, we can negotiate our way out of it. The war escalated again. And so we grew up with this idea that this war will be there forever. I mean, I guess like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we just thought Sri Lanka will be forever at war, and we have to, this is what we have to live through. So when it ended, it was such, I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. In 2009 when the war ended, and we naively thought, now we can learn from our mistakes, and Sri Lanka, because we know it's a beautiful island full of so much potential, and that this is going to be a new dawn. But then where are we now? 10 years or, well, a bit more, 14 years later, we're back in another crisis. So the Civil War for me was always the backdrop to my childhood. Even though I was in Colombo, insulated from it, I didn't bear the brunt of it like my fellow Sri Lankans in the north and the east did, or maybe in the south. But it was always the backdrop. And so with my first book, I wanted to write a book about Sri Lanka that didn't mention the war. That was, I thought, because all the books tend to talk about ethnic conflict, I thought, can I write a book about the 1996 World Cup and two men who drank arak and watched cricket? So that was that one. But with this, I thought, okay, now the war's over. Maybe it's time for me to make sense of it and write about it. And that's really what I looked at doing. But of course, the book took on many other turns.
Now, Sri Lanka is again in the middle of some turmoil economically. So, how do you perceive it, and how will Sri Lanka bounce back from there?
Well, like I say, I lived too long in Sri Lanka to believe in these false dawns. But and we had a number since then. 2015, we thought it'll be a new beginning with a new government. Then the Easter attacks happened, and suddenly we were back with terrorism on the island, though it's a different ethnic group this time that was involved. And then the government that was voted out before came back in. We had the pandemic and ban on organic fertilizer, tourism industry was destroyed, and suddenly the country's bankrupt. And now we're thinking, what next? And you know what happened last year. We had suddenly the whole nation gets on the streets, kicks out a president, and so now people ask me what is Sri Lanka like at the festival? What's it like now? The best answer I can give it's better than it was 6 months ago. 6 months ago it was in chaos and turmoil. Now at least there's some stability there. But the problems have not been solved in the sense the country is still bankrupt, inflation is still raging, and a majority of the population is being pushed towards poverty. And we need proper solutions for this. And we keep thinking that we're going to bounce back, let's have an election. And I'd like to see if there's any new ideas, that can stop us repeating the same old tropes and mistakes of the past. So we hold on to hope that at least we can learn this time. But it wouldn't surprise me if 2023 ends up in another catastrophe. It just seems that this is the Sri Lanka that I've grown up with, and we don't seem to be able to come out of this cycle.
Now, your biggest weapon is satire and the way you used it. You're a copywriter as well, and you iterate a lot of times. So, how do you describe your writing craft? The Nobel Academy looked at it as afterlife noir, and there's a lot of dark humor. Do you do that deliberately? Do you enjoy that writing process?
Yeah, so I don't deliberately say, let's put some jokes in this serious story. I write from the point of view of a narrator. So once I find the narrative voice, I go, and I guess I've selected two humorous guys. The first one was a drunk sports journalist who was at the end of his life, but looking back, not with bitterness, with a bit of bitterness, but also with a great deal of humor and looking at the absurdity of the Sri Lankan situation. And I think similar with Mali Almeida. This was someone who was putting himself on the line in danger in the war zone, but also saw again the absurdity. And I think that's the common thread that I look at. I'm looking at grim things about Sri Lanka, but also with the absurdity you can see the funny side and at least use some black humor to temper these. Because if I wrote it completely serious, I think it'll get hard going, and the Sri Lankan tragedy is a depressing read. But strangely enough, Sri Lanka is not a depressing place. Anyone who goes there knows that. Even when in a cricket match, when the team is losing, the band keeps playing. And so that cheerfulness and optimism is something that we celebrate, whether it gets in the way of serious discourse and serious solutions. That's a valid point as well. But I think it's part of the Sri Lankan national character, and maybe it's part of my sensibility as a writer.
So you shed some great light on what people call the dark heart. Now, when you were in India, you were at the Kerala Lit Fest as well. Do people ask you a lot about cricket and the other similarities which bring the two nations together?
Not so much now. They used to. But now I think I'm writing about ghosts. Now people talk politics. Maybe I preferred it when they were talking cricket. But going to Kerala, yeah, I'm there next month as well. I think you see a lot of similarities between Sri Lanka, especially the food, the landscape and the people. And so yeah, those are the discussions. Obviously there was cultural exchange between these two parts of South Asia, because you see a lot of similarity in the character of the people and definitely in the food. But no, not so much cricket talk now. I think and hopefully when my next book comes out, there won't be too much ghost or political talk.
So do you follow Indian and Sri Lankan cricket, and whom do you follow? Which player do you follow the most?
Yeah, so after I finished the book, I stopped watching cricket as religiously, because you're done with the subject. But Sri Lankan cricket went through a second golden age after '96. You had Sangakkara, Mahela, Malinga, Murali, Matthews, and Rangana Herat. So we still had enough talent to keep us in the top, at least the top level teams. But now it's a young team. We have to qualify for World Cups, and when we play against India, it's no match. I remember those days; they were quite tightly contested matches. Both teams have abundance of talent, but India is at they can play their second, third 11 and still be competitive against us. So yeah, I don't watch it as much, but I do like the look of this team. They're a young team, and there's no real superheroes or superstars, but a lot of talent, and we seem to have an assembly line of mystery spinners and a lot of batting talent. So let's see. Even the '96 team were hammered all through the '80s, and they suddenly gelled as a team and were able to become great. Maybe that will happen now with Sri Lanka, but let's see. It's a long way from the golden age at the moment.
And you still play the guitar at your band? Or?
Not with a band, but I still carry the guitar around, and I still try and play every day. Maybe I will form a midlife crisis band in a few years, but not so much. I just play for private pleasure only. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. It was lovely talking to you.